There aren't many things that creep me out to the point of being uncomfortable, but there's a photo of John Lennon that gets me every time. If you know which one I'm talking about, congratulations. You are just as mental as I am. Hello, welcome to the very first episode of Sorry I Brought It Up with Mel Z, me. So, the photo is of John Lennon signing an autograph for a fan. It's simple enough, but it's also sinister because the man in the photo who's asked for the autograph is Mark David Chapman, who would murder John Lennon just a few hours later. He's wearing sunglasses in the photo, so it looks like he's looking down, watching him sign. But if you zoom in, you can see that his sunglasses are down, but his eyes are actually fixed on John's face, which is unnerving. He knows he's going to kill him. In fact, he's tried before, and he's been working up the nerve to do it for days now. And this just isn't quite the moment yet. I wanted to make a short form video for this story, but I got so caught up in the research and there is just so much to say. I had so many questions. Of course, I've known about this for so many years. I wasn't born when it happened, but it's now been 45 years since John Lennon's murder, and I thought that was a pretty good reason to do the first ever episode of this podcast. So welcome. This is the story of John Lennon's death. I wouldn't say that I'm the biggest Beatles fan in the world, but I definitely know most of their songs, like probably 90%. I probably like 30%. I don't even know how accurate that is, but I definitely love a lot of songs. John Lennon's death is one of those celebrity deaths that really sticks out. I think the fact that John Lennon seemed to be such a nice guy, an artist trying to do good things, trying to bring good things into the world, and somebody killed him. It just doesn't seem fair. This sounds bad, but I could think of so many people who deserved it more than he did. Much more. Like, I know that sounds bad. I know that's not a nice thing to say. But let's get real here. That's the deal. He didn't deserve it. And this was a tragedy. I'm not the king of the world and I'm not the death master. So let's just get into the story. John Lennon had been famous for a long time. He was a former Beatle and was now a solo artist with critically acclaimed music of his own. He was one of the most famous and adored people in the world. He'd just turned 40. He was newly energized, living at the Dakota in New York City with Yoko and their son, Sean. John and Yoko had moved to New York to live freely and escape the UK tabloid culture. The Nixon administration saw John as a political threat because of his anti-war messages and activism, and they were attempting to deport him. This was something that John and Yoko had been fighting against for years, and they eventually won. They lived a famously artistic, unconventional, and deeply bonded life in a beautiful historic building, the Dakota, in New York City, where they were raising their son, Sean. They were collaborating musically and politically and were happy. 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, however, was a ticking time bomb, and nobody seemed to know it except for him. He grew up in a violent, abusive home, became a major Beatles fan, was doing drugs as a teenager, but then became a born-again Christian. When John famously said in 1966 that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, Chapman took it personally. He burned his Beatles records and began a fixation on John Lennon and his supposed hypocrisy. Chapman briefly worked as a camp counselor and was known for being intensely religious. Around this time, he was introduced to The Catcher in the Rye and became consumed by Holden Caulfield's crusade against quote-unquote phonies. Eventually, he merged that identity with his own. In a jailhouse interview, Chapman later said of John Lennon, "He told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was with millions of dollars and yachts and farms and country estates, laughing at people like me who he believed the lies and bought the records and built a big part of their lives around his music." Chapman had long-standing mental health issues, including depression, dissociation, violent ideation, and a fragile sense of identity. He later said that he felt himself, quote, disappearing, and was desperate to define himself through an extreme act of any kind. He wanted something to make something out of nothing, which was what he believed he was. Before coming to New York, he had actually attempted suicide in Hawaii, where he was living, once by attaching a hose to a car exhaust on a beach. Police intervened and he was put in a psychiatric ward. He later said that he should have stayed in treatment. Chapman had already traveled twice to New York in late 1980 with the intention of killing John Lennon, but both times he backed out. He told his wife that he'd been obsessing over the idea. When he got home from one of those trips, he actually showed her the gun that he had bought and was planning to kill John Lennon with. He told her that he had changed his mind, that he was feeling better, that he didn't want to do it anymore, and that he had thrown the gun into a body of water. But on December 6th, he returned to New York again, lying to his wife and telling her that he was going there to clear his head and figure out how to become a better man and possibly father in the future. I'm not blaming her, but I don't know how she bought that at all. That's insane. Like, come on. Obviously, not blaming her at all. She was with an abusive, insane man. So, but I'm just saying, it's crazy that she bought that. While in New York, Chapman wandered around Manhattan trying to build up the nerve to do what he came there to do. He hung out with other fans who were standing outside of John Lennon's apartment and actually asked one of them out on a date. He hired a sex worker at one point, but he mostly just stalked John Lennon and stood outside of his apartment building waiting until he could gather the strength to shoot him. On December 7th, the day before the shooting, he accosted singer James Taylor at the 72nd Street subway station, which was right by the Dakota. According to James Taylor, quote, "The guy had sort of pinned me to the wall and was glistening with maniacal sweat and talking some freak speak about what he was going to do and his stuff with how John was interested and he was going to get in touch with John Lennon." On December 8th, 1980, John woke up early. He and Yoko went for breakfast at their favorite breakfast spot. There's a cute picture of them on the patio, not from the day of, but close to the day. The breakfast spot was open until about 2008 and only closed because the landlord raised the rent an insane amount. John spent time listening to one of Yoko's new songs. Then he and Yoko did a radio interview about his and Yoko's newly released album, Double Fantasy. He also took photos with fans outside of the radio station and outside of his building. At one point during the day, their nanny brought their son, Sean, back to the Dakota after an outing, and Mark David Chapman was standing outside like he had been for days. And he reached out to Sean and grabbed his hand. And that is upsetting. He touched the hand of the man that was going to kill his dad in a few hours. It's awful. One thing that really shook me about this story that I didn't realize is that very famous photo of John and Yoko, where Yoko is fully clothed and John is naked, kind of wrapped around her, curled up, that was taken by photographer Annie Leibovitz this day on December 8th, 1980. At one point in the day, they had a photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz, and she came to their apartment in the Dakota and took these very famous, like iconic photos of them. Rolling Stone asked Annie Leibovitz about the photo years later, and she said, "I remember peeling the Polaroid and him looking at it and saying, 'This is it. This is our relationship.'" Later in the day, they go to a recording session nearby and leave at about 10 to 11. Honestly, a big thing that shocked me too is how much he did in a day. It made me feel lazy. Like, I'm not doing enough. If he's doing this much on the day that he dies, good Lord, I got to get my shit together. While John was spending the day with his family, Mark David Chapman was alone in a hotel room. He decided that this was going to be the day that he would do it, and this would be the last time he was in his hotel room. So he left some things for investigators. On his dresser, he left his passport, an 8-track tape, and a Bible open to the Gospel of John, where he had handwritten Lennon beside John. He took his .38 caliber revolver loaded with 5 hollow point bullets that he had intentionally bought because he knew how much damage that type of bullet could do. After leaving, he also bought another copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and he signed it to Holden Caulfield, the main character, from Holden Caulfield. "This is my statement," it said. He returned to the sidewalk outside the Dakota to wait, where he had already been waiting for so many days. And later in the afternoon, John and Yoko left the Dakota to go to the recording session. Chapman had the chance then to shoot, but he couldn't quite do it. So instead, he held out his copy of Double Fantasy for John to sign. He didn't say anything to him, but John Lennon signed. He signed John Lennon, 1980. Chapman said later that John was very gracious and kind to him, and that he had a limo waiting, but that he stood there and made sure that he was satisfied. He asked him if he wanted anything else. And shockingly, this is where that famous photo comes from. There was a photographer who happened to be standing there and captured a photo of John Lennon signing Mark David Chapman's copy of Double Fantasy. It's an absolutely insane photo and moment to capture. The fact that somebody was there and thought to take the photo and that they're both in it. It's a truly upsetting photo. Around 10:50 p.m., John and Yoko were done at the recording studio. Yoko suggested that they go get dinner, but John said he wanted to get home before their son Sean went to bed. So they headed home. As they exited their limo, they were walking toward the Dakota entrance, and Chapman emerged from the darkness and fired 5 shots, with 4 of them hitting John Lennon. He staggered up to the steps, but collapsed inside the Dakota. One newspaper reporter said that they had heard Chapman call out, "Mr. Lennon," and that John Lennon had slightly turned. But Chapman said that he doesn't recall saying anything and that Lennon didn't turn around. But who knows? He was clearly out of his fucking mind. After the shooting, Chapman put the gun down, removed his coat, and sat down and started reading his new copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Just, I guess, waiting for police to come get him. They did, and they arrested him without incident. John was taken to the Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors worked on him, At first, they didn't realize that this was John Lennon they were working on. But after they saw the contents of his wallet and somebody said, this kind of looks like John Lennon, then another doctor who was actually off shift but had seen the commotion or heard the commotion at the Dakota came in and saw Yoko leaving with David Geffen. He came in and confirmed, this is John Lennon, who the man whose chest you're inside of, manually pumping his heart. That is John Lennon. And the doctors have said that they had a moment of, holy shit, this is crazy, and then immediately had to just get right back to it. But imagine that. Oh my God, it's insane. So they worked on him. They couldn't resuscitate him. They never once got any vital signs back. When they opened him up, his heart was actually empty, they said. He had lost 80% of his blood. John Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival. He died of gunshot wounds to the chest and to the lung. When doctors came out to tell Yoko that John was officially dead, she screamed and got down on the ground and couldn't believe it. She was screaming, he was just alive. I was just sitting next to him. It makes me sick. It's awful. She then became really worried that her son was at home. They were heading home to their son, and she knew that he was at home watching TV, and she was terrified that he was going to find out that his dad was dead on the news. So she wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. She left with David Geffen, and there's photos of them leaving the hospital. She looks terrible, wrecked. It makes me want to cry. I hate it. And so she went home and told her son the next day that his dad was dead. The hospital actually agreed to delay their announcement until she could get home to make sure that he didn't hear it on the news. Millions of people heard the news that John Lennon was dead when Howard Cosell announced it during Monday Night Football. Radio stations everywhere dropped programming, and huge crowds gathered outside the Dakota singing Beatles songs. And Yoko and Sean could hear them from their apartment, which I would imagine would have just been so upsetting. I saw an interview with Ringo where he said, why did they have to sing those songs outside of that apartment? Why couldn't they have listened to his music and sung his music at home? It was extra tormenting for Yoko and Sean, who were trying to grieve. And although it's a lovely gesture, it's like they weren't grieving a Beatle. They were grieving the man that they loved. So just what a horrible moment. This death, though, was huge. It marked the end of an era. It was the silencing of a very influential voice and someone who people found hope in. And also it ended the hope that there would be a Beatles reunion at some point, which people were really desperate for. One of the crazy things that I read about was that on the day of the murder, David Bowie was actually performing on Broadway in The Elephant Man, and that he was supposedly second on Mark Chapman's list. David Bowie later said, Chapman had a front row ticket to The Elephant Man the next night. John and Yoko were supposed to sit front row for that show too. So the night after John was killed, there were 3 empty seats in the front row. I can't tell you how difficult that was to go on. I almost didn't make it through the performance. That's insane. I can't even believe that that's true, but it is. In January 1981, Chapman pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but months later, against his lawyer's advice, he changed his plea to guilty, claiming that God told him to. He refused an appeal. On August 24th, he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment. There was no trial. Ringo and his wife visited Yoko and Sean immediately, and Paul and Linda McCartney came shortly after. George didn't visit in person, but he issued a statement and he wrote a tribute song for John. When she was asked if Chapman deserves forgiveness, Yoko told the reporter that she'd heard a story about the Pope going to visit the man who had tried to assassinate him, the Pope, and that he forgave him. Then she said, "I'm not a pope," which I thought was really funny and very true. Fuck you. I don't need to fucking forgive you. Fuck you. Chapman has expressed remorse. He said in an interview with Larry King in 1992 that John Lennon was not actually a phony and that he was just so out of it with his own mental illness that despite how gracious and kind Lennon had been to him that day, he was just so mentally ill that he couldn't think any other way. Chapman has since been up for parole and denied parole 14 times since he was first eligible in the year 2000. His next scheduled appearance is in February of 2027. Chapman's wife is still his wife, and she visits him. She lives in Hawaii, but she visits him and has conjugal visits with him. Okay. They run a prison ministry together, and she is still very much hoping for his release. Okay. The double fantasy album that Mark David Chapman handed to John Lennon to sign earlier in the day on December 8th, he actually put in a planter pot, and it was discovered there after the shooting later by a stranger, and that person turned it over to the cops. And once the investigation was closed and the court dates were all over, they gave that record back to that person, and they kept it in their possession for a while, but eventually sold it at auctions, and it's been sold a few times. The current owner is a private collector, and it's worth a lot of money. Imagine having that. That was one of the first things I wanted to know. What was he signing, and where is that? Where is it? And I was actually shocked to find information on that. It's usually one of those things where I have so many questions that I can't find any information on. But this actually, I was able to find info on it and photos of it. So that's the kind of thing that I absolutely will obsess over. Yoko and Sean actually lived in the Dakota for many years after. They didn't want to leave. Yoko lived there until 2023. She actually still owns it, and though she lives now on a farm up in northern New York. She's in her 90s now. Sean Lennon said that the reason they stayed was because it would have been weirder to run away, that was where John had lived, that's where they had loved him, and there were memories of him there, and they wanted to remember the good memories and not the horrifying ones. He said, though, that every time they would go into the building, he would make sure that his mom walked in front of him because he would have constant dreams of his mom being shot. I can't imagine walking past that iconic Dakota archway every time you get home. I guess eventually you wouldn't think of it as, oh, my dad was killed here. My dad was killed here. But wouldn't you? I don't know. I would, but maybe not. I don't know. You get used to things, and maybe you stop thinking about those things in that way. But wow, to continue living there is they were criticized for it, which is so stupid. People are just so bored, and they have opinions on things that they don't understand all the time. This is such a sad story. I can't get over it. I'm shocked at how many people are still alive that were part of this story. Doctors and cops and Yoko and John's children and several Beatles too. This is one of those celebrity horror stories that makes people not want to leave their houses and makes you feel like the world is scary. I'm sure that after this, not a single Beatle went out alone for a very long time. Years later, George Harrison's house was broken into and he was stabbed over 40 times. Somebody tried to kill him in his own home. They scaled a wall. I'm sure there were death threats and incidents with the other Beatles as well. I can't even imagine how scared they must have been. It's wild that they were literally just musicians, just trying to make music, and they got really big and tragic things happened. This being one of the most tragic moments in pop culture history for sure. What do you think? Were you around when this happened? Do you remember where you were when you heard that John Lennon was shot? Tell me in the comments. I'm also on Patreon and I have bonus content there. I have extended content that's sometimes 2 times the length of what I post on social media. I post behind the scenes stuff, essays. If you want to support me, I'm a Canadian, so we don't get paid by the platforms. If you want to support me, come over to Patreon. This is my first episode. I thought that it was necessary because of the 45th anniversary, and this is just such an interesting and sad story that deserved more airtime than just like a 3-minute social media video. So let me know, what do you think I can improve on? What do you think of this story? Blah, 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 blah. That's it. Thank you so much for being here. Oh my God, I started saying some really weird things to you. I thought it was an interesting story, but